All right, I think we're ready to start. Cool, can you hear my voice? All right, so the talk is CoffeeScript Edge. Let me start by telling you a little bit about myself. I discovered CoffeeScript back in early 2010 when it was still a very new thing, just a few months old, and I immediately fell in love with it. I almost immediately decided I liked it so much I wanted to write a whole book about it. So I sent a proposal to Prague, and a year later, CoffeeScript Accelerated JavaScript Development came out. And I was very happy to have been the first person to write a book on this thing, which has just exploded since then in a way that very few people would have anticipated. And Brendan Ike was even kind enough to blurb my book and say that it'll help you to become a better JavaScripter in the process of reading it. So you don't, one of the things I want to accomplish in this talk is to dispel the myth that CoffeeScript is for people who hate JavaScript. It's really not that at all. So I'm going to start by talking about the history of JavaScript, which should be a refresher for most of you. I like to think of JavaScript as having three eras. First, there was the ancient era of JavaScript from about 95 to 03, when this newfangled scripting language came along and people didn't really know what to do with it. As recently as 2001, Paul Graham was telling people you probably shouldn't even use JavaScript in your website. And this is kind of amazing because this is an essay that was very forward-thinking. He was talking about how the web is the new platform. You should be writing applications for the web instead of the desktop. But he was saying, don't use JavaScript. Just have it all on the server. And that didn't really change until 2004, medieval era. And Gmail came along and really got people thinking, wow, I mean, Ajax makes applications much more responsive than would otherwise be possible. You get the much more desktop application-like experience, the browser, with heavy use of JavaScript. And of course, you had Douglas Crockford coming along and telling people about the good parts. How many of you saw Crockford's talk on JavaScript yesterday morning? Most of you. Yeah, in that talk, he had that line where he says, every programming language has good parts and bad parts, but JavaScript has some of the best parts of any programming language and also some of the worst parts. So he was advocating using style to ignore the bad parts of JavaScript and just focus on the good parts. And he also created a tool, JSLint, toward that end. That's an automatic checker you can run against your programs to make sure that you're not doing things like using the with keyword, which is an abomination, and a lot of other stuff like that. And of course, jQuery came along, and it's become the standard JavaScript library. There were some others initially, Dojo, Prototype.js, which have been largely forgotten. So it's kind of nice that now we have this standard, like jQuery is actually used on most websites that make significant use of JavaScript. And there are other good libraries out there, but jQuery is just such an improvement over what we had before, and it's such a pleasure to use. So it's kind of nice that we have that standard to go on. And then in 2009, suddenly we have, the way I think of this picture is, JavaScript was sort of sitting at the kid table before. Like, it wasn't a serious adult programming language. You're still writing most of your application logic in something else that ran on the server. And maybe you had one guy at the office who knew JavaScript, and you'd ask him to add like client-side validation in your forms or whatever. But it wasn't a really serious thing until few things happened. One is Node.js in the last couple of years. That's been huge. Suddenly, when you talk about writing JavaScript, you have to clarify, are you writing JavaScript for the browser or for the server or desktop even? And of course, there was JavaScript on the server before Node.js, but Node.js just nailed it and made it something that so many people wanted to use. And that's just been huge. You also see JavaScript cropping up in other places where people just need a scripting language, like the databases MongoDB and CouchDB. So JavaScript rising up to become a major programming language has happily coincided with the rise of NoSQL. And that's great. It's just a great scripting language wherever it's used. And of course, JavaScript used to be incredibly slow, This graph is a couple of years old. It's showing it took 30 seconds to run this piece of code in IE7 that as of this time took 3 seconds to run in Chrome, and now it'd be like 1 second. I mean, think about this. The phone you have in your pocket runs JavaScript faster than IE7 on a high-end machine right now. Like, that's just incredible progress because you have Google, Microsoft, Apple, and other companies all throwing money at making JavaScript faster. So it's arguably the fastest dynamic language on the planet right now, faster than Ruby, faster than Python for many applications. So 10 years ago, Paul Graham was telling people don't even use JavaScript. Now he's funding companies that are teaching JavaScript as their first programming language. Codecademy had huge success with this Code Year campaign. They got 400,000 people to sign up to resolve as a New Year's resolution, I'm going to learn code this year. Mayor Michael Bloomberg signed up for it. So JavaScript, just because it's so incredibly useful, because it will run anywhere, it is becoming a sensible choice for beginners to learn programming. So now if you know JavaScript, you're feeling pretty good. For those who haven't seen this Monty Python sketch, this presents a world where everyone is Superman, but only one man knows how to repair a bicycle. He tears off his Superman uniform and leaps out as bicycle repair man, and everyone is amazed. So I feel like if you've known JavaScript all these years, you feel like that bicycle repair man. Like now everyone needs you more than ever, even Superman. Oh, so you might have been thinking these last several slides, like, wow, this guy really likes JavaScript. JavaScript must be his favorite programming language, in which case you forgot the name of this talk. I am here to talk about CoffeeScript, which was invented by this guy, Jeremy Ashkenazi, in late 2009. He called it a little language that compiles to JavaScript. That's sort of its philosophy in a nutshell. It's not trying to be a huge project. It's just the minimum necessary to create a better language on top of JavaScript. He announced it on Christmas Day 2009 on Hacker News. Got a lot of attention right away, and over the next year made a lot of progress with a 1.0 release in Christmas 2010. So that was about a year and a half ago. It's now up to 1.3, and there really haven't been any major changes over that time. It's been pretty stable, mostly just bug fixes, minor improvements. And this was a big event. Just a year ago, it was announced that Ruby on Rails would have CoffeeScript support out of the box. And that led to this epic meme war on GitHub. It was the first, there's a Tumblr epic pull request, I believe it's called. This was the first one. In fact, this got so many comments that people started to complain to GitHub about if they had left a single comment, they got 100 emails from the next 100 commenters. And that was actually the reason why GitHub added that little checkbox at the bottom of each commit saying, I don't want to receive email notifications anymore. So this was pretty controversial, but most of the reaction was positive. They were like, you know, no one is forcing me to use CoffeeScript. It's just going to be really easy from now on to use it as part of Rails. And Rubyists, as a rule, never liked JavaScript that much for syntactic reasons. CoffeeScript sort of aims at improving that. Right? It's mainly aimed at improving that. DHH, of course, the creator of Rails, he's a big fan of CoffeeScript. During his keynote at RailsConf last year, he said that looking at CoffeeScript was the first time that I felt language envy. And this is coming from the guy who loved Ruby so much that he invented Rails. So that's really saying something, that there's another language with features that he actually sort of wishes were in Ruby. You've got some other famous fans of CoffeeScript, like Ward Cunningham, the inventor of the wiki. He's kind of an old school programmer. Smalltalk is his favorite language, but now he's sort of taken to CoffeeScript as his favorite language. And you've got Brendan Eich, creator of JavaScript, who's said he uses both sometimes. And this has actually influenced his thinking about the future of JavaScript. You might have heard the news that just last week, the ECMAScript specification was extended to include this operator from CoffeeScript that allows you to declare a function in 2 characters. Now, of course, that means that only Firefox is going to support that anytime soon, and that's why we have precompilers like CoffeeScript. And here's Brendan Eich and Jeremy Ashkenaz giving a joint talk at JSConf last year. So again, I don't want you guys to think that CoffeeScript is the enemy of JavaScript. They're absolutely complementary. You can love them both like I do. So who uses CoffeeScript in the real world? Well, not a lot of big companies are in on it yet. I'm hoping you guys will help change that. But a lot of startups have gotten into it. Certainly 37 Signals, the Rails guys, they use CoffeeScript for all their JavaScript now. Posterous and Airbnb, these are Y Combinator funded startups. They're using CoffeeScript heavily. Well, Posterous not anymore. They were bought by Twitter. Cloud App is like my favorite thing on my Mac. You need to all Google that as soon as you can. It's the most incredibly useful utility. Trello, created by Joel Spolsky. He wrote a blog post about using CoffeeScript for that application. So a lot of people who are very experienced programmers, they sort of itch to use CoffeeScript on their next new from the ground up project. And Hotel Tonight is an interesting one because they created an entire iPhone and Android app using, I believe they use Titanium Accelerator. So all the code is actually in CoffeeScript, no Objective-C or Java. Oh, and if you go to the CoffeeScript wiki, you can see more examples of real-world uses. So think on this for a little bit. If you go to GitHub, they have a list of the most popular languages, and CoffeeScript is currently number 12. For comparison, C# is number 11. So my goal for this year is to overtake C# on GitHub. Based on CoffeeScript's progress, it seems doable. So let's start looking at the language itself. First, I want to dispel some myths about CoffeeScript. People ask, is CoffeeScript like some sort of VM that runs a language like Ruby or Python in the browser? And no, there's no VM involved. Sometimes this frustrates people who really want to run Ruby in the browser, but just think about that. Like that would mean that every time you write A equals B, it would have to compile to, well, if B is a function, then do this. If it isn't a function, do that. And that's really not what CoffeeScript is about. A equals B just compiles A equals B in JavaScript. It's not a library like jQuery. It's fully compatible with all JavaScript libraries. So I see people all the time saying, I've heard a lot of buzz about this CoffeeScript thing. I might try using it instead of jQuery for my next project. No, they're not alternatives. Definitely keep using jQuery if you like jQuery. It is definitely not GWT, which is Google's solution to the problem of JavaScript not being Java. And then they tried again to solve that problem more recently with Dart. For some reason, companies like Google especially, they attract people who just love static typing and are just allergic to anything dynamic and see that as a huge problem that needs to be fixed in the browser. So that's why you get things like GWT and Dart. I think most of us are kind of happy with, well, so the big advantage of it not being something like GWT and Dart is that if you enter alert hello world, that is a one-liner in CoffeeScript that translates into a one-liner in JavaScript. If you do that in Dart, it is 17,259 lines of JavaScript that comes out because there's this whole standard library that gets pulled in whether you're using it or not, and defining custom classes for arrays, and Dart is kind of crazy. So the motto of CoffeeScript is, it's just JavaScript. And here are some actual examples of how CoffeeScript compiles. A equals B. If A isn't already declared as a var in scope, then you get the var keyword automatically. And otherwise, it's just A equals B. You have this is keyword. One of the things that Crockford talked about is that you should never use JavaScript's double equals with the type coercion. And the makers of CoffeeScript agreed on that. So there is no way to get double equals as compiled output from CoffeeScript. It's always going to be the strict triple equals. There are implicit parentheses, like in Ruby. You don't have to use them if you don't like implicit parentheses, but they're there if you want them. And of course, one of the nicest things is this abbreviated function syntax and also implicit returns. So you get very succinct functions. And since JavaScript tends to have functions nested in functions, that becomes exponentially useful, which is why it's now a part of the JavaScript standard. So it is just syntactic sugar, basically. There are a couple more syntactic sugars from Ruby. One is string interpolation. Just enter a hash mark and curly braces and put your variable in there. And this is actually one of the features that becomes people's favorite things about CoffeeScript. Like I hear people on Twitter saying, this is the reason that convinced me to use CoffeeScript. You have JSON literals where commas are implicitly inserted by new lines. I don't know about you guys, but when I'm coding JavaScript, feels like half the errors I get are from accidentally either omitting a comma on one of those lines or putting a comma on the last line of my array or object. So it's really nice to not have to do that. There's actually a tool, Hansson, it's called. You can look it up on GitHub. That's just compiling CoffeeScript-style object literals to JSON-style object literals if you want to do this. And you can also omit curly braces on object literals and have indentation be significant. So this is a lot like YAML, if you're familiar with that. So it's that easy to define an inner object inside of an outer object. Another nice thing is there's a don't repeat yourself syntax where if the key is the same as the value, then you just have to say it once. And that actually gives you a nice symmetry because in CoffeeScript you can also write this syntax for pulling out the variable x from the object with key x. And you can even do that right in a function definition. So if your function takes an object and you just want to pull a few values out of that object, you can do that right in the function definition. A few more of these syntactic sugars. There are postfix if, like in Ruby, also unless. You can just have CoffeeScript call the function f if it's defined by putting a question mark after it, like in Groovy. It's easy to check if an object is non-null just by putting a question mark after it. Very useful for checking errors in Node.js, where you have to say if error isn't null all the time. And you can also use that question mark operator to say, if x exists, give me x. If it doesn't exist, give me y. And then, of course, there's the whole significant white space thing, which is probably the most controversial part of CoffeeScript, but I'll leave you to judge whether it's useful. Here's an example from a program I wrote. You have a for loop on the outside. You have a try-catch block inside of that. The catch is implicit here because I'm not doing anything with the error, just ignoring it. And then there's an if-else, well, an if and then an if-else. And this is the equivalent JavaScript. It'll take a while. So yeah, I much prefer the former version of that. Oh, also, notice that all the variables are declared at the top of the scope, which is another thing that Crockford talks about. Because JavaScript scoping rules are kind of weird, it's much easier to keep track of scopes this way. And CoffeeScript does that automatically for you. So if you ever have a bug that's caused by scoping, it's very easy to go to compiled output and look at where the variable scope is. So CoffeeScript is often accused of being a hipster language, and to that I say, whatever. So CoffeeScript automatically adds a function wrapper around each file that you put in, which has long been considered a best practice in the JavaScript world. I mean, you look at jQuery, for instance, it consists of about a dozen modules, each of which lives in a wrapper like this. And it's just to keep those variables in separate scopes, because files don't do that in JavaScript. JavaScript has no notion of files, not in the browser anyway. Yeah, people ask about this on Stack Overflow a lot. And when they ask, I say, you gotta believe, and that's parappa the wrapper. It's a pun, wrapper. So, if else in JavaScript doesn't create scope, parentheses don't create scope, objects don't create scope, loops don't create scope. This messes people up to no end. And files don't create scope. So if you want to create scope, got to declare a function and use the var keyword. And there's actually a startup that talked about how because their Node.js application was missing a var keyword, their application ran out of memory and crashed. And their conclusion was, well, should have used CoffeeScript. And to be fair, there are other tools out there that'll do this for you. You can just have a program that runs as a scanner on your JavaScript files to make sure you aren't declaring any implicit globals. But if you're using CoffeeScript, you don't have to worry about it at all. So like if we're using I in this loop here, I is automatically declared for us and scoped. So that's sort of a JavaScript best practice that's embodied as a default thing in CoffeeScript. And of course, in JavaScript, you wouldn't want to not have indentation for your ifs and elses and nested functions. So now you have to. No way to get double equals out. On classes, this is, like I've talked about the basic syntactic sugars. That's half the reason to use CoffeeScript. The other half is this whole class syntax. And let's look at why you would want to use classes. Here's an object. When we run lifeatl.showAnswer, what is the output that we're going to get here? This actually isn't a trick question. This is just the obvious answer. This is 42. But what if we run this? Now it's actually going to depend. Whoops. Well, the reason that set timeout isn't going to work the way it intended is that this means something different depending on whether the function is called as a property of an object or not. And this is definitely one of the most common sources of bugs in JavaScript. Now, CoffeeScript, of course, doesn't change the meaning of this. It doesn't mess with the semantics of JavaScript. But what it does do is make function binding much easier. Because in JavaScript, you've got to call some kind of helper function, whereas in CoffeeScript, you just say, I'm going to use equal greater than sign to declare this function instead of dash greater than. And that declares a bound function, which will normally declare a function that's just bound to the current scope. This inside of that function means the same thing as this outside of it. Or in the context of a class method, like we have here, it automatically binds that method to the class instance every time that the class is instantiated. So when we create a new instance and then pass that method to set timeout, it gives you the answer that you want. We can also have private variables within classes because a class is really just a function. It scopes things the way that functions do. And this is another syntactic sugar that when you have that @ symbol, @ is another way of writing this in CoffeeScript. I should have mentioned that earlier. When you have @ something within a function argument, it automatically attaches that argument as a property to whatever the context of the function is. So this is equivalent to writing this.radius equals radius. Again, CoffeeScript is great if you hate repeating yourself. So this is a nice, succinct way of writing a circle class, and that all works as you'd hope. All right, but the real reason to use classes is that you have inheritance out of the box. And JavaScripters, they've invented a lot of libraries over the years to do sort of class-like inheritance. And this is really just embodying the approach of those libraries take, especially Google Closure library, for instance, and making it a part of the language. And it's really equivalent to how classes are inherited in things like Backbone.js, where you have an extend method on these objects. So let's have a little bit of a refresher. How do classes work? It's the prototype chain in JavaScript. So this is another syntactic sugar that when you have double colon, that means document.prototype, document double colon. And when you look for a property on an object and that property doesn't exist on the object, then JavaScript automatically looks at its prototype, which in this case is document. And if it's not on its own prototype, it'll look at the parent prototype, which is backbone.model here, because we said document extends backbone.model. And it goes on all the way up to object, which all objects have prototypal inheritance from. And there's one other nice thing that you have this super, which is taken from Ruby, where it automatically just calls the parent function with all arguments automatically. You can declare class level methods by saying this dot whatever equals whatever, or at whatever for short. All right, so that does it for our CoffeeScript JavaScript review. Hopefully I've convinced you that CoffeeScript is a pretty thin layer on top of JavaScript. If you already know JavaScript, you basically already know CoffeeScript. So very easy to jump on board, switch between the two. Maybe use CoffeeScript for part of your application, JavaScript for another part. Like when people want to get started with CoffeeScript, what I suggest doing is just write your tests in CoffeeScript. Just see how that works as a trial run. You'll find that your test files are a lot shorter, more fun to write, and then you can decide from there whether you want to use CoffeeScript for the main part of your app. Let's talk a little bit about tools for using CoffeeScript. This is one thing that I'm very thankful has changed in the year since my book came out. Like, most of that book is still up to date, but in the first section on getting CoffeeScript installed in your system, the subsection on Windows says, use Cygwin. Now, thankfully, that's changed because if you go to the Node.js site, they have installers available for you to grab right away, Windows, Mac, and source code if you're a Linux person or just want to build from source. And they made it incredibly easy. Yeah, I should have loaded this beforehand. So once you install Node.js, then installing CoffeeScript is a one-liner from the command line, and it'll work on any major platform. So even if you're a Windows person, getting started with CoffeeScript is now very, very easy. Because Node comes with npm, the Node package manager, so you just say npm install -g coffee-script. The -g is for a global install, so that'll take the CoffeeScript binary and put it in your bin folder or whatever the Windows equivalent is. And if you want to specify a particular version, like 1.3.0 just came out yesterday, so you might not want to have the latest. So just say at 1.2.0 at the end of that. So this gives you the coffee tool on the command line, and if you add the -w flag when running coffee, then it'll continually watch a directory and recompile the CoffeeScript in there to JavaScript. If you're using a web framework, there's probably a plugin that'll compile CoffeeScript from it directly. Rails has had it for a year. There are certainly plugins for Django and many Java and .NET frameworks as well. If you're developing a static website, there are some interesting tools like Middleman, which compiles CoffeeScript as well as Haml and Sass, if you like those. Makes it very easy to use those for static web development. So you don't have to have a back end to make use of CoffeeScript. There's a great tool called Live Reload, which I just love, that not only does all this background compilation of things like CoffeeScript, but also will refresh your page every time that something changes. So it just makes web development very fast. Or if you want to do a script, you can write something called a cake file, which of course is named for a CoffeeScript make file. And it looks something like this. This is a cake file that Sam Stevenson wrote. Sam Stevenson, 37 Signals, creator of Prototype.js, very avid fan of CoffeeScript. And this looks like a lot of code, but it's also doing a lot. It's a very customizable script. You can say, like, I want to compile my CoffeeScript and then run tests on the compiled output, and then if those tests pass, I want to do this. So if you like CoffeeScript and you want to use CoffeeScript as your only programming language in your CoffeeScript, then that's a way for you to write CoffeeScript project build scripts in CoffeeScript. There's probably a CoffeeScript plugin for your favorite text editor. The sort of official one is Jeremy Ashkenaz's TextMate plugin, which also works in Sublime Text 2, which is cross-platform. Vim, Emacs, Eclipse, whatever you're into. One interesting thing about JavaScript is that JavaScripters haven't really become fans of documenting their code. Like things like, there isn't really a Java doc for JavaScript that's caught on. But Jeremy Ashkenaz, another thing he created is a very lightweight tool called Doco, that all it does is parse your comments, run them through Markdown, and create HTML that just beautifully describes your code, putting the comments next to the code. And CoffeeScript itself, you can look at the entire CoffeeScript source annotated in this form, and it just looks great. So I would really encourage you, if you're starting a new JavaScript or CoffeeScript project, to take a look at Doco. And then there's testing. In the previous version of these slides, I had like 3 or 4 JavaScript test frameworks listed, and I was like, okay, this one's good for this one's good for that. But then Mocha came along, and it's good for everything. So I just recommend that you take a look at Mocha. It is really good, and it runs in both the browser and Node.js. There's always this epic war going on with test frameworks where some people prefer the basic assertion-based syntax, and other people prefer the BDD, more English-like syntax. And Mocha supports either. You can just plug your favorite syntax into it. You can plug your favorite assertion library into it. You can plug your favorite test output formatter into it. So it's just a unified way of doing these things. And it also supports any language that compiles into CoffeeScript. You just tell it, associate this extension with this compiler, and it'll support it. Incidentally, the talk after this one in this room is about JavaScript testing. I don't know what frameworks they're going to be talking about, but I'm going to stick around for that because I'm always curious. So now I'd like to, how am I doing on time? I'd like to leave you with some thoughts on the future of how this might change the way that web apps are developed. So a few months ago in Stack Overflow, someone asked this question, and it was a perfectly well-defined question, pretty good amount of detail, asking, I have this Jade element. Jade is a markup. It's a lot like Haml, but it's Node.js based. It can also run in the browser. And so they asked this question, and I read the whole question and had to ask them, so are you using Jade in the browser or on your server? And he said, oh, good question. I'm actually not sure. So this is a really new area of confusion. Like, this would not have happened more than 2 years ago. This guy was using SocketStream, which is it's a web framework written in CoffeeScript, actually sponsored by AOL of all people. I don't know what they're up to with that. So he wasn't sure how all that was working. And so suddenly this boundary between client and server is really breaking down, and you can have JavaScript that runs in both places. One tool that does that is Stitch, which was developed by 37 Signals. What Stitch lets you do is write JavaScript as Node.js modules and test them like Node.js modules. And then when you're done, you feel like everything is tested properly, then compile it into something that deploys to the browser. So very simple, but very different approach for developing for the browser than we're used to. Then there's sort of the inverse of that, Browserify, which is a browser tool that automatically connects the plugin and connects to the server and lets you require modules as if you were in a Node.js environment. And there's JSDOM, which is maybe the most interesting thing going into the future that I can think of. JSDOM just lets you simulate the DOM, that is a browser environment, from Node.js. Now think about that. If your server can efficiently simulate a browser, what could you do with that? One thing you could do is, instead of your current server-side templating language, just use jQuery. Just have raw HTML on the server and manipulate it with jQuery code on the server before serving it to the client. For a lot of web applications, that would actually be very easy, and would also allow you to just write one piece of code in jQuery that you use in both places, rather than, as is currently the norm, having to write the same code twice, essentially, when you want something to be renderable via AJAX, as well as from the server. So this is something to ponder. And I think that because CoffeeScript is such a nice language, because it's become my favorite language, I like it even more than I like Ruby and Python, that makes this a much more appealing alternative to move everything into this one common language that you can run everywhere. Or to put it in simpler terms, all you really need to do on the server is have this thin layer between the browser and the database that just checks security and whatever. Like, do you have permission to access that data? And everything else can be an MVC client-side framework. So yeah, that concludes my talk. I have a new book that just came out, Async JavaScript, if you want to look into that. And I will now field any questions. Yeah.
I'm curious as to what the code output from creating a class in CoffeeScript is.
Yeah, why don't we take a look at that? So the question was, what does it look like when you write a class in, oh, I thought I turned mirroring on. Oh, it was on before.
Including extension.
Yeah, so this is kind of a lot of code, but you notice that it's just finding a couple of helpers at the top, and the helpers are really doing all the work. So CoffeeScript, again, doesn't have a standard library. It just brings in as many helpers as you need. And extends is by far the most complicated one. There are only a total of 5, so don't worry about having tons of helpers in your output. So once you have that extends helper, which really does all the work, then it just extends a super.
And I noticed that B doesn't actually have to be declared because this is just translating a piece of script.
Right, B could be anywhere. Yeah, so you have this syntax for declaring things that are part of the class A prototype. So that compiles, as you see there, to a.prototype.a equals B. Versus this, which is the static declaring a.x equals y. So that makes sense because this within the class body points to the class itself. This is actually kind of an oddity that the colon and equals mean the same thing in that one context. That's the only case where that's true. Another cool thing about CoffeeScript, actually, let me switch over to the REPL. So you can have postfix loops in CoffeeScript like that. And this is a list comprehension. If you're familiar with Python, you might have seen this before. So it's just taking the output of that loop automatically and turning it into an array. So that is each time you iterate through the loop, it pushes something to this new array. And that can give you incredibly succinct code. I mean, the alternative is to write that in JavaScript, is what I'm saying. Yeah?
So what sucks about CoffeeScript? What are some rough edges?
Yeah, so the main downside of CoffeeScript is that you still have to debug JavaScript ultimately. You really shouldn't learn CoffeeScript if you don't understand JavaScript and aren't able to understand it. Now, the output from CoffeeScript is pretty readable. Like, it's certainly more readable than, say, minified JavaScript. Debugging that is a nightmare. One very interesting development going into the future is source maps. Some of you have probably heard about this, that in the Canary Chrome, you can use this feature where it maps the original source of compiled JavaScript to the original source so that when you get an error, you can actually have in your developer console, you can see the line in the original CoffeeScript, for instance, that generated that error. Now, this isn't fully implemented yet, but it's the next priority for CoffeeScript going forward. So this is something that people have been talking about for a while that's definitely going to become a reality sometime this year. And that's also going to work for minified JavaScript. So source maps are definitely something that's going to take off very quickly for developers. Yeah?
Can you use CoffeeScript with other like MVC frameworks like Backbone or Crockford?
Yeah, you can use CoffeeScript with any JavaScript library. It certainly works especially well with Backbone, which of course was created by the same guy who created CoffeeScript. So Backbone classes obey the same rules inheritance-wise as CoffeeScript classes, which makes them completely intercompatible. If you have another library that declares classes, you might have subtle differences if you're using both approaches. But then, of course, you don't have to use CoffeeScript's class syntax if you don't want to use it. Yeah?
Do you know anyone who's using this to build scripts that work with Ember?
There are definitely some people using CoffeeScript and Ember together, yeah. I know that Yehuda has mixed feelings about CoffeeScript. But I mean, he likes it, but not enough to really use it. No, he actually made some feature requests for features he wanted in CoffeeScript classes that would make it function more smoothly with Ember. And those requests were sort of shot down. But it's still, you can definitely use them together. Like there's nothing stopping you. All right, if you have any more questions, feel free to come up to me, and thank you.